years. He's a master potter. So instead of moving the handle, he leaves that handle exactly where it is. And then he writes on there, Lewis Miles says my handle's going to crack. That jar is in a private collection in Charleston, and to this day that handle's in the same spot it was when he put it there in 1854. So Dave was correct. Now again, this is all speculation, but there had to have been some sort of relationship between the two men where there was trust, where Dave, who is owned by Mr. Miles, can write this on there without any type of retribution. He says, my owner is wrong, and I'm going to put it on his jar for everybody to see he's wrong. So there was something there. A lot of people have asked why Dave continued to write on these jars. Miles's uncle-in-law and brother-in-law did not allow Dave to write on these jars. As soon as Lewis gets him, he allows him to start writing on these jars again. Again, remember, it's against the law. Slaves are not supposed to know how to read and write. And these potter, you got to remember, these potteries were in the middle of nowhere. They're making all this stuff. Dave is not writing on every one of them. You've got overseers. This stuff is being shipped everywhere because stoneware at the time was the Tupperware, and it was the mason jar of the time. That stuff didn't come into existence till well into the 20th century. So everybody needed this stuff. All the big plantation houses, they needed this stuff. So your overseers were coming in, or the stuff was being shipped somewhere. Then you probably had, the overseers, or he probably brought some hands with him to help him load these wagons, and then this stuff ended up in the kitchens of these big houses. So for the most part, those people who may have had a problem with Dave writing on this never saw these jars. You see where I'm going with this? I mean, they never would have seen them. But here's the story I like. This is the story I like about why Mr. Miles allowed Dave to write on these jars. They were making all this stuff, and Lewis had a stop on the railway at the time built for the train to stop to pick up the wares to take on. And one day that train did not stop. It kept going. Ended up in Graniteville. Well, Mr. Miles chased that train down in his wagon. And when he got to the other end, he pulled a great big chain off of his wagon, and he went to the train, and he wrapped the train around the railroad track and put a great big padlock on it. And he told the engineer, he said, I bet you this will remind you to stop at my place next time. And I've always said, if this man's chaining trains to the railroad track, he can do whatever he wants to do. I'm not the one to tell him he can't do what he wants to do. That was just a great story we heard. It came down from the Miles family. Over noble Dr. Landrum's head, may guardian angels visit his bed. April 14th, 1859. Abner Landrum has passed away. Dave has heard about this. Remember, Dave initially was working for Harvey Drake. Abner was his uncle. We believe Abner's the one that really kind of set things in motion for Dave to learn to read and write. So obviously Dave had a soft spot for Dr. Landrum at this time. So he wrote that on one of his jars. A pretty little girl on a verge. Volcanic mountain. How they burge. I'm going to leave that right there. Right there. Yeah. He's pretty amazing. He's an amazing guy. I made this jar all of cross. If you don't repent, you will be lost. May 3rd, 1862. Anybody recognize that date? What's going on at that time? Is Dave going to talk to Mr. Miles, or is Dave going to talk to any of the landowners there and go, y'all need to stop this war. This war is a problem. Is he going to say that to anybody? No. So what he's saying? You don't repent, you will be lost. He's not saying anything about the war. But I think if you read that in the time frame, I think you can kind of maybe agree that Dave maybe means something else. I believe so. If you don't repent, you will be lost. 1862. In 2006, our field crew on Savannah Riverside were working, and we have a process by which we go out into the field and we get a scope of work, and we have to go test this area before DOE and the other contractors do work in it. So my guys go out and they're working that day, and I get a phone call. And the guy, and we do everything by radio, you know, the radio where they're going to be at, and radio. But they called me on the cell phone, and they said, "Do we have anything in the office that has Dave's signature on it?" Paraphrasing myself, I said, "Are you kidding?" And they're like, "No." So 1862 was the first piece that came out of the ground. The jar was broken into 19 pieces. It weighs 18 pounds. But that was the first piece. When they lifted 1862, Dave's signature was on a piece just below it. So they found the jar. They found it in a 20th century trash pile, trash bin. Been busted and had been broken. It's the only jar found in an archaeological context to this day. Maybe some others have been found by folks who out, maybe not quite doing archaeology, who have found some things. And there's been a lot who find stuff in barns and things like that. It's the only one that's been found in archaeological context. April 16th, 1862. This is the jar we just talked about, Repent at the Cross. And that's a May 31st, 1862 jar. These are the last three jars that we know of that was actually dated. So ours is actually the third to the last jar. And these are all pretty much relative in size.
Did they usually have lids?
They could have had lids. He would have made lids. Ours, I'm going to talk a little bit about ours in a few minutes, you know, what we think it is. But he would make every part of it, the lid, whatever was needed. We started using the jar as an outreach, public education outreach piece. You know, if you're fortunate to see Dave jars, they're either in museums or private collections. We took this one out everywhere we would go, show it to folks, and we decided to make a little film called Discovering Dave, Spirit Captured in Clay. If you haven't seen it, I can tell you how to go online and find it. It's all over the place to watch it. Some of the folks here, this is Miss Jill Coverman, who used to be the curator at McKissick Museum, passed away just before the film was finished. Unfortunately, she didn't get to see the film finished. Mr. Steve Farrell, who was the potter there in Edgefield for quite a while, being interviewed. And of course, Mr. Leonard Todd, author of Carolina Clay. And Darian McLeod. Darian McLeod was our Dave in the field. If you know Darian, Darian is a great artist, a great actor here in Columbia area. And he was our Dave. Spent the whole day with us. This film is a nonprofit film. We don't make any money off of it. I interviewed a lot of people, including my boss, Dr. Keith Stevenson. Darian is the only one I paid. I said, Darian, I gotta have you. I gotta have you. He said, Dave, our Darian came out and was our Dave. And what's amazing is the jar was thrown by Justin Guy. Justin Guy is kind of now the Edgefield potter. Steve has kind of moved on. And Justin would throw the jar. And as Justin said, Darian couldn't throw a jar against the side of a wall. So what happened was Justin would get in and start pulling it, and then as Darian touched the jar, it would fall apart. So we'd have to take a few minutes to pull the jar back up and get it going again, so we could have Darian on. But it was a great day. We spent the whole day out there. He was a trooper. It was in July or it was August when we filmed. And it was 104 at 7 o'clock in the morning. So. And we had Darian doing the same things Dave would have done. He said, Darian, I need you to dig some clay. So he would dig the stuff, but tough day, long day. So, you remember that ceramics image I showed you earlier? There was no jars. How many jars there were? There's no jars. I was doing a presentation. Prior to the presentation, a couple comes in. They got a jar. They want me to look at this jar. They show me this jar. I look at that jar. Nice jar. That's the jar right here. Pretty jar. I start doing my presentation, doing pretty much the same thing I told you. Between 1843 and 1849, there are no jars. Dave did not sign a jar. Why he didn't sign the jar? Franklin, they didn't, blah, 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 blah. And then I stopped. And I found that couple in the crowd. I said, what's the date of that jar? 1845. This is the only jar that we know of from the silent period. What's called the silent period. August 16th, 1845. It's been in their family forever. I spoke at the Lexington County Library. Is that right? Lexington County Library, I think that's where we're at. And they put my name on the marquee. George Wingard speaking on Dave the Potter. These people had absolutely no clue who Dave the Potter was. All they know is they had a jar that had the name Dave on it. And it was a piece of pottery. So they brought it in, had no clue what they had. Been in their family since day one. So, great piece. So, we now stand corrected. There's one jar that we know of. And he signed it Lewis Miles. So during that silent period, Lewis yet again was working with Dave. So, it kind of changes everything of what we think about during that silent period. This is a noble churn. Fill it up, it will never turn. Dave. March 19th, 1858. This is the SRP jar. Visiting its sibling here before it was sold at auction. Now this is a churn. There's the Dave jar. You can see it under there. It's twice that high. It's twice that high. You literally have to stand on the barn to churn this churn. So it gets back to when you go, Dave knew how to make things. And I think there were times when he made things knowing, basically saying, look, I can make this churn. And I can make it real big. Because I'm that talented. I know what I'm doing. So it's pretty amazing to have gotten to see this churn.
Did you ever see the dasher that went in it? I can't imagine you.
I know Dasher came with it, but I mean, I have to, again, you would have had to stand on the top of the barn to churn it. I mean, you couldn't have stood, you certainly couldn't have stood behind you because it was this tall. You know, you needed to sit down, you know, you would have had to.
What was the price it was sold for?
I'm not sure, you can go online and look that up, I really don't know. We take the Dave jar out and do a lot of stuff with it over the years. I remember one week in particular, I spoke to a DAR meeting, and all the ladies came in in jewels and sashes and things. And then a couple of days later, I was in a barn speaking to like a hoedown at the jar. And then a couple of days later, I was in Beaufort at the Verdier House speaking to a packed house at the Verdier House. So the jar has traveled. Here you see you've got a bunch of kids out in the woods getting to stick their heads in it and see it. They get to touch the Dave jar. See the Dave jar. Another group down here. So, you know, we want the jar to go out. We want people to see it. That's kind of the whole point of what we do in our Dave jar. And finally, what I'm about to show you here is the broken jar. What we believe happened to the jar is there was one little piece of the handle. We photographed every piece before we put it together. It's been put back together with an epoxy that we can soak it in hot water and it'll glue, or the glue will melt away, not leave any residue. This is a piece. This is right beneath the handle. And if you look here at the handle, there is a major fissure here where the clay, there was a bubble in the clay. And actually, if you could feel in here, you would feel that bubble. So what I like to say here is that we're glad he didn't write, LM says this handle will crack on this jar. We think that may have been what happened here. We'll never know exactly what happened here. But so what I'll do now is show you the jar, and then y'all can certainly leave them up afterwards. Afterwards, you can all come up. This is the Dave jar. This is it. LM, Lewis Miles, April 16th, 1862. And there's Dave's name right there. What we have here, the handle's missing. We never found a broken handle. They were toting it, it snapped. Prior to its breaking, what we have is we have a smooth top. We believe this would have looked very much like a churn. The top is smooth. Did the top break on purpose? Did they do it, or did it break by accident? Did they do this on purpose? Because it is smooth. A lot of the potters we've talked to said that they probably used it as like a sharpening knives on. And over time, the edge became smooth. You can certainly, when you come up, you'll be able to feel the edge compared to the broken shape here on the side here. We don't think this was ever used as a churn per se. There are no striker marks inside of it. What we do have is we have a lot of the alkaline glaze that's been eaten off about 2/3 of the way up, which upon speaking to a lot of the potters and speaking to Ms. Coverman, this was probably used as a sauerkraut jar. Sauerkraut being very acidic, probably ate the glaze off inside of the jar. So.
What's the inscription again?
There is no inscription. This is April 16th, 1862,
Just a date.
and a date in his name. So not fortunate enough to have an inscription on it, but we do at least have thing on it.
What date did you find out?
We found this in 2006.
And where?
2006 on the Savannah Riverside.
There's no inscription, but there is something significant about that day.
Yep, I was going to get.
Oh, I'm sorry. Russian?
My boss. And I told him not to heckle. Let me answer your question, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
No, it's not a question. I'd like to make a statement.
Sure, go ahead.
You are fathomed by why he did all of this. African Americans knew that they could not get credit for so much that they had done. But as you can see, it is a testament that it lives even after they're gone. They did their best at whatever they did. So if you saw a big whatever, and even if they were not able to sign it or do things, you'll always know what that particular parlor and who he was, how he did it. He had the skill and the craft that you could not take from here. That is why African Americans throughout all history, they always, when they were able to do something, and I am African American and anyone else that's of a descendant, we are proud people. And we come from a very proud people. So you can enslave our bodies, but you can't enslave our minds.
That's good.
That's exactly when I talk about Dave, I remind people exactly what you say. I say, you know, when you go to Charleston, you see these big houses. They're made out of brick. You see the iron work. You see the woodwork. You see all of this. They didn't get to leave their name on that work that they did. Dave kind of speaks for all of them. Dave reminds us that there were craftsmen out there. There were craftspeople out there who were doing amazing stuff. And that, you know, he really represents that craft that was being done. So that's another thing really important, you know, for Dave. So. Sure.
And another thing, the continent that Dave comes from or his ancestors come from, the things that were done were things that they brought with them. So someone did not teach them, they taught others. So a whole lot of the crafts that you see, especially when you go anywhere near the coast, you're seeing things that came from the coast or where they came. And so you have to always keep that in mind. I thank you for stating that African Americans, and they were enslaved. So if you're enslaved, you know, there's a whole lot, you got to work around a whole lot of parameters, you know, but at the same time, you can still get things done, you can still learn, you can still do things, but, you know, you really can still leave a legacy. Out of all of that, you can still leave a legacy, and no one can take it away.
Exactly right. And that's what I hope we did with the film, if you get a chance to watch the film. So, the date that Dr. Stevenson is referring to, April 16, 1862, that date is the date where it was emancipation of the slaves in Washington, D.C. That was that date. So we scoured every newspaper we could, southern newspaper we could, to see if we could find any kind of frame of reference. Which, of course, southern newspapers aren't going to put that in the newspaper. But we wanted to exhaust everything we could. Was this a coincidence date? Or did Dave somehow know this? Did Dave backdate this? You know, this jar could have been made a year later. But he knew that date from somehow. That we'll never know. But I always thought it was a very poignant date to end up on this jar. You know, especially when the next jar that we know of repented the cross or all will be lost. So it makes you kind of think that maybe these two jars bookend, the date and then repent at the cross. So, any other questions? Any other comments? You want to throw some fruit or anything?
Is that area still a pottery center? Are there active potters there now?
I'm sorry,
In
Pottersville?
Yeah, are they active potters
No,
there
yes,
now?
you can go to Edgefield and they have what's called the Phoenix Factory. I believe it's still open. Boy, there's always something going on in Edgefield, let me tell you. If you know anything about Edgefield.
We were just there
there's
a few
al-
months ago, and they said that there was a potter and they were gone.
Okay,
So
so
like,
there, well, there's
there's
always
right
some,
now.
there's always been an uproar in Edgefield, and there's still an uproar. So obviously, as of now, there is no potter. I did speak to Justin recently. I do know that I know his wife has moved on from the Tompkins Library, and she kind of holds works at the deed office there now. So there has been a little bit of uproar there with what's going on in town. It always has been. They're always shooting each other in the town square. Yes, ma'am.
For the kilns that you were describing being so huge, what did they use for the fire source? Was it like oak wood or something else? How did they create such an intense fire in that huge?
Just whatever's the surrounding wood, I'm sure the hardwoods, oak, sweet gum, whatever, in those woods surrounding. You know, this was such an amazing, again, once you go from 30 feet to 105 feet, now you're tripling the scale of what was being done. But they had a workforce to go out. There was no, for the most part, Edgefield, the Pottersville area, I should say, was predominantly, they're making the pots. You didn't have a lot of agricultural going on in that area around the potters. So these guys, what they were doing, out cutting the wood, doing the fire. And you had people like Dave who was, he was an expert across. He knew how to make the pots, but he would have also known how to read that kiln. When was the time to fire it? What was going to happen with the weather? When were they going to be able to fire it? How long to fire it? What signs to watch for to get ready to pull it out? So he was